The insurance investigator handed me the preliminary report with a grim expression. Pisses Chen. The evidence is pretty damning. Accelerant was found in 3 separate locations in your studio, and the fire started from the inside. Given your recent financial troubles and the fact that you're the sole beneficiary of the insurance policy, he didn't need to finish. I could see it in his eyes. He thought I had torched my own art studio for the money. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What he didn't know was that I had been expecting this conversation for weeks. Not because I was guilty, but because I knew exactly who had set me up. My mother-in-law Patricia had played her cards perfectly, or so she thought. It's the accelerant, the timing, even the conveniently placed evidence. It all pointed directly to me. She had orchestrated this with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years in real estate, understanding contracts, insurance policies, and how to make problems disappear. But Patricia made one crucial mistake. She underestimated me. While she was busy planting evidence and crafting her narrative, I was building a case of my own. Every condescending comment, every calculated move, every moment she thought she was outsmarting me, I had been documenting it all. The recording device hidden in my purse had captured more than she could have imagined, including her proud confession about how she had solved the Emma problem once and for all. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to my clothes 3 days. After the fire, a constant reminder of how quickly everything could change. I sat in the parking lot of the Riverside Heights police station, staring at the text message that had shattered what little hope I had left. It was from my husband Richard, and it contained just 4 words that made my blood run cold. Mom found your receipts. The receipts. I knew exactly what Patricia had discovered, and the timing couldn't have been more devastating. Earlier, I had purchased supplies for what was supposed to be my breakthrough art exhibition. Canvas, oils, turpentine, and yes, paint thinner, lots of it. It's the kind of supplies that any serious artist would buy in bulk to save money, but also the exact kind of materials that could be twisted into something sinister by someone with the right motivation. Patricia Chen had been waiting for an opportunity like this for 3 years, ever since Richard and I got married. She had never approved of our relationship, constantly reminding anyone who would listen that her son could have done better. Emma isn't from the right kind of family, she would whisper to relatives at gatherings, not caring that I was within earshot. She's going to drag him down with her artistic nonsense.
Ow.
The artistic nonsense she referred to was my converted garage studio, where I created paintings that had started gaining recognition in local galleries. It was my sanctuary, filled with years of work and dreams. More importantly, it was insured for $80,000 money that Richard and I desperately needed since his accounting firm had cut his hours and my freelance design work had dried up during the economic downturn. I remembered the exact moment I realized Patricia knew about our financial situation. It was during Sunday dinner 2 months ago, when she casually mentioned how unfortunate it was that young couples today didn't know how to manage money properly. Of course, sometimes desperate people do desperate things, she had said, looking directly at me while cutting her roast beef with surgical precision. Fire insurance fraud is so common these days. Such a shame when people think they can outsmart investigators. At the time, I had assumed it was just another one of her passive-aggressive comments designed to make me feel small. Tricia excelled at this kind of psychological warfare, always maintaining plausible deniability while landing perfectly aimed emotional strikes. She would compliment my cooking while suggesting improvements, praise my artwork while mentioning how difficult it was to make a living as an artist, express concern for Richard's happiness while implying that I was the source of his stress. But now, sitting in this parking lot, with the smell of destruction surrounding me, I understood that her comment about insurance fraud hadn't been casual at all. It had been reconnaissance. She was already planning her attack, studying the battlefield, and identifying my vulnerabilities. The art supplies receipts were just the ammunition she needed. My phone buzzed with another message from Richard. "We need to talk? Come home now." The drive back to Maple Grove Drive felt like a funeral procession. Every familiar landmark, the coffee shop where Richard and I had our first date, the park where we walked our dog before we had to rehome him. Due to financial stress, the hardware store, where I had unknowingly purchased the evidence that would be used against me to mock my naivety. How had I been so blind to what was happening right under my nose? When I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Patricia's pristine white sedan parked across the street. She was sitting behind the wheel, talking animatedly on her phone, but I caught her watching me through her rearview mirror. When our eyes met, she gave me a small wave and what could only be described as a satisfied smile. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that she wasn't just an opportunistic bystander capitalizing on my misfortune. She was the architect of my destruction. Richard met me at the front door, his face pale and drawn. In his hands were the receipts Patricia had somehow obtained from our financial records that she had no legal right to access, but had somehow acquired anyway. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Emma, please tell me there's an explanation for this. The fire investigator called an hour ago. They found accelerant residue that matches the paint thinner you bought last month." He held up the papers with shaking hands. "They show you bought enough supplies to burn down half the neighborhood." I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him to make him see what was really happening. His mother hadn't just found these receipts by accident. She had been planning this moment for months, maybe years, waiting for the perfect storm of circumstances to frame me for a crime I didn't commit. But looking at Richard's devastated expression, I realized that explaining the truth would sound like the desperate lies of a guilty person. "I bought those supplies for my exhibition," I said carefully, measuring each word. "You know that. You helped me load them into the studio." The timing, Emma. Right when we're facing bankruptcy, right when we need money the most, and now this fire happens? Richard ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of processing overwhelming stress. "The insurance investigator is treating this as a suspicious claim. They think you deliberately set the fire." Through our front window, I could see Patricia still sitting in her car, no longer pretending to be on the phone. She was watching our house with the focused attention of someone enjoying a carefully orchestrated performance. The satisfaction on her face told me everything I needed to know about who had provided the investigators with my purchase history and who had been feeding them theories about my financial motives. That night, as Richard tossed and turned beside me, I made a decision that would change everything. If Patricia wanted to play games, I would play them better. If she thought she could destroy my life with careful manipulation and false evidence, she was about to learn that underestimating Emma Chen was the biggest mistake she had ever made. I had always been a careful person, someone who documented important conversations and kept detailed records. It was a habit that had served me well in my design work, where clients often tried to change project specifications after the fact. But now that same attention to detail was going to become Patricia's downfall. She might have set the perfect trap, but she had no idea that I was about to turn her own weapons against her. As I lay in the darkness, listening to Richard's troubled breathing and the distant sound of Patricia's car finally driving away, I began planning my counterattack. She wanted to frame me for arson. It's fine, but first she was going to confess to exactly how she had done it, and I was going to record every single word. The next morning brought Detective Lisa Rodriguez to our front door, her badge gleaming in the autumn sunlight as she introduced herself with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed suspicion. She had the weathered look of someone who had seen enough insurance fraud cases to spot them from a mile away, and I could tell from her first question that Patricia's groundwork had been thorough. "Mrs. Chen, I understand you've been experiencing some financial difficulties lately," Detective Rodriguez said, settling into our living room chair with a notepad that already contained several pages of handwritten notes. "Your neighbors mentioned seeing you working late in the studio recently, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning. That must have been stressful." Neighbors. The word hit me like a physical blow. Patricia lived 3 blocks away, but she had somehow convinced our immediate neighbors to become her unwitting accomplices in building a case against me. I thought about Mrs. Henderson next door, who had always been friendly when she saw me carrying canvases to the studio. Had Patricia convinced her that my late-night painting sessions were actually something more sinister? "I'm an artist," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the growing realization of how deep this conspiracy ran. Artists often work unconventional hours when inspiration strikes. There's nothing unusual about that. Detective Rodriguez nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested she had heard similar explanations before, none of which had proven convincing. Of course. And these art supplies you purchased last month, quite a substantial amount of flammable materials for someone working on paintings. The way she emphasized paintings made it clear that someone had already planted seeds of doubt about my artistic legitimacy. I wondered what story Patricia had crafted about my work, what lies she had spread to make my art supplies seem like arson materials rather than the tools of my trade. As Detective Rodriguez continued her questioning, I found myself remembering conversations from the past year with new clarity. Patricia's seemingly innocent inquiries about our insurance policies during family dinners suddenly took on a different meaning. Her casual mentions of news stories about insurance fraud weren't random observations, they were psychological preparation, designed to plant ideas and gauge reactions. 3 months ago, she had visited our home while Richard was at work, ostensibly to bring me some of her famous lemon bars. But now, I recalled how she had lingered in the kitchen, asking detailed questions about our mortgage payments and whether we had enough savings to weather Richard's reduced income. At the time, I had appreciated her apparent concern for our welfare. Now I understood she had been conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about our vulnerabilities. Your mother-in-law mentioned she's been worried about you, Detective Rodriguez continued, consulting her notes. She said you've seemed increasingly desperate lately, talking about needing a fresh start and how the insurance money could solve all your problems. The blood drained from my face, not because the statement was true, but because it was so perfectly crafted to sound plausible while being completely fabricated. Patricia had managed to create a narrative where my supposed desperation justified extreme measures, where insurance money appeared to be my salvation rather than a random benefit of a tragic accident. I never said anything like that to Patricia, I said firmly. In fact, we rarely discuss our finances with her at all. Seemed quite certain about the conversation, Detective Rodriguez replied, making another note. She mentioned it happened during Sunday dinner about 3 weeks ago, when you apparently broke down crying about your situation. 3 weeks ago. I remembered that dinner clearly because it was the last time I had felt genuinely hopeful about our future. I had just received word that a local gallery was interested in featuring my work in their upcoming schwa breakthrough that could have provided the exposure needed to establish my career. I had shared this exciting news with the family, expecting support and celebration. Instead, Patricia had systematically dismantled my enthusiasm with a series of pointed questions about the gallery's reputation, their sales history, and the likelihood that emerging artists actually profited from such exhibitions. By the end of the evening, she had managed to transform my moment of triumph into an anxiety-inducing discussion about the harsh realities of the art world and the foolishness of pursuing unrealistic dreams. But I had never cried, and I had certainly never suggested that insurance money could solve our problems. Patricia had taken my genuine vulnerability about pursuing my artistic career and twisted it into evidence of financial desperation and potential criminal intent. Detective Rodriguez, I think you should know that Patricia has never been supportive of my marriage to her son, I said carefully. She's made it clear on numerous occasions that she believes Richard would be better off without me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The detective's expression remained neutral, but I caught a flicker of interest in her eyes. What kind of things has she said? I recounted the years of subtle undermining, the passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern, the way Patricia consistently positioned herself as Richard's primary emotional support, while treating me as an unwelcome intruder. But even as I spoke, I could hear how petty and paranoid my complaints sounded compared to the concrete evidence Patricia had apparently provided. Mrs. Chen, I understand that relationships with in-laws can be challenging, Detective Rodriguez said with practiced patience. But what you're describing sounds like typical family friction, not evidence of a conspiracy to frame you for arson. She was right, and that's what made Patricia's strategy so brilliant. Every individual incident could be dismissed as normal family dynamics or misunderstanding. It was only when viewed as a pattern, a coordinated campaign spanning years, that The true scope of her manipulation became clear. After Detective Rodriguez left, I sat alone in my kitchen and forced myself to reconstruct the timeline of Patricia's campaign against me. The real estate background that had taught her about insurance policies and property values. The gradual collection of information about our financial situation through seemingly innocent family conversations. The cultivation of relationships with our neighbors, positioning herself as the concerned mother-in-law, worried about her son's unstable wife. The art supply purchases had been the perfect opportunity she had been waiting for. The timing couldn't have been more convenient or mounting dead. My need for materials for the gallery exhibition and the approaching deadline that required me to work intensive hours in the studio. She had probably been monitoring our bank statements somehow, waiting for just such a purchase to appear. But the fire itself that required access to my studio and knowledge of how to stage an arson scene convincingly. Patricia was many things, but she wasn't a criminal mastermind with expertise in accelerants and burn patterns, which meant she had either educated herself extensively about arson investigation techniques, or she had help from someone with relevant knowledge. I thought about her social circle, the network of retired professionals she had cultivated over her decades in Riverside Heights. Real estate agents, insurance brokers, contractors, and inevitably, people with connections to emergency services. In law enforcement, Patricia had always been proud of her ability to network, to leverage relationships for mutual benefit. It wouldn't have been difficult for her to gather information about how arson investigations worked and what evidence investigators looked for. The more I analyzed her strategy, the more impressed I became with its sophistication. She had created multiple layers of evidence, from the financial motive to the physical evidence to the character assassination that painted me as unstable and desperate. Each element reinforced the others, creating a web of circumstantial evidence that would be difficult to challenge individually while building an overwhelming case when considered collectively. But Patricia had made one crucial error in her planning. She had assumed that I would react emotionally to being framed, that I would panic and make mistakes that would further incriminate me. She expected me to be the same passive victim who had endured years of her psychological abuse without fighting back effectively. What she didn't realize was that her years of subtle torment had actually prepared me for this moment. I had learned to be observant, to document inconsistencies, and to think strategically about how to protect myself from her manipulations. The same skills that had helped me survive family dinners and holiday gatherings were now going to help me expose her criminal conspiracy. That evening, I began making calls to my own network of contacts. Jake Morrison, my best friend since college, worked for the Riverside Heights Fire Department and had been one of the first responders to my studio fire. If anyone could help me understand the technical aspects of the arson investigation, it would be Jake. "Emma, this is serious," Jake said, when I explained my suspicions about Patricia. "If you're right about her framing you, she's committed multiple felonies. But you're going to need more than circumstantial evidence to prove it." "I know," I replied. "That's why I need to get her to confess. I think I know exactly how to make that happen." Jake met me at the Bluebird Cafe the following morning, choosing a corner booth where we could speak privately while maintaining the appearance of a casual coffee meeting. His firefighter training had taught him to assess situations quickly and thoroughly, and I could see him processing the implications of what I was proposing as I laid out my plan. "You want to bait Patricia into confessing by pretending you're planning to flee the country," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Emma, that's incredibly risky. If this backfires, you'll look even more guilty. If I do nothing, I'm going to prison for a crime I didn't commit," I replied, pulling out my phone to show him the research I had conducted the night before. "I've been looking into arson conviction rates. Once the district attorney decides to prosecute, the success rate is over 80%. Patricia has built a perfect circumstantial case against me, and every day that passes makes it stronger." Jake examined the legal documents and case studies I had compiled, his expression growing more serious as he realized the depth of my predicament. "What exactly do you need from me?" "Technical credibility," I said. "When I confront Patricia, I need to sound like someone who actually understands how the fire was set. I need details that only the real arsonist would know. Information that will make her believe I'm finally ready to admit guilt and run." Over the next hour, Jake provided me with insights into the investigation that hadn't been shared with the public. The accelerant had been applied in a specific pattern that suggested knowledge of fire behavior and building construction. The ignition point had been chosen to maximize damage while creating the appearance of an electrical accident gone wrong. Most importantly, the arsonist had used a delayed ignition method that provided time to establish an alibi elsewhere. Whoever did this wasn't an amateur, Jake explained. They understood how fire spreads in enclosed spaces and how investigators analyze burn patterns. This was planned by someone with either professional knowledge or very thorough research. Armed with this information, I spent the afternoon crafting my performance. Patricia's weakness had always been her need to feel superior, to demonstrate her intelligence and strategic thinking to those she considered beneath her. If I approached her as a defeated opponent seeking her wisdom, she would be unable to resist the opportunity to gloat about her successful manipulation. The key was making her believe that I had finally accepted defeat and was ready to flee rather than face prosecution. I needed to present myself as desperate enough to abandon everything, but not so panicked that she would become suspicious of my sudden change in attitude. That evening, I called Patricia and asked if I could visit her privately to discuss something important. The eagerness in her voice when she agreed confirmed that she had been expecting this moment, anticipating my eventual surrender to her superior strategy. Patricia's Victorian home on Elm Street had always intimidated me with its perfect maintenance and museum-quality furnishings. Everything was positioned precisely, from the antique photographs to the carefully arranged flowers, creating an atmosphere of controlled perfection that reflected her personality. Tonight, however, I noticed details that had previously escaped my attention: the real estate awards lining her hallway, the professional networking photos showing her connections throughout the community, the subtle displays of wealth and influence that had enabled her campaign against me. "Emma, dear, you look absolutely exhausted," Patricia said, as she led me into her immaculate living room, her tone carrying just enough false sympathy to maintain plausible deniability. "This whole situation must be incredibly stressful for you." "It is," I replied, allowing genuine exhaustion to color my voice. "Patricia, I need your advice. You've always been so much smarter about these things than I am." The compliment had the desired effect. Patricia's posture straightened slightly, and I caught a flash of satisfaction in her eyes. She had been waiting years for me to acknowledge her intellectual superiority, and my apparent capitulation was providing the validation she craved. "Of course, dear. What's troubling you?" I pulled out my phone and placed it on the coffee table between us, the recording app already activated and hidden behind a fake music streaming interface I had prepared. The police seemed convinced that I set the fire deliberately. "Detective Rodriguez has been asking about our financial situation, about the insurance policy, about my art supplies. I think they're going to arrest me soon." "Oh my," Patricia said, her concern so perfectly performed that I almost believed it myself. "That does sound serious. But surely if you're innocent, the truth will come out eventually." "Will it?" I asked, leaning forward with apparent desperation. "You know how these things work better than anyone? You've seen what happens when investigations focus on the wrong person. Sometimes innocent people get convicted because the evidence looks bad, even when there's a logical explanation." Patricia nodded thoughtfully, clearly enjoying her role as the wise advisor, dispensing hard truths to the naive younger woman. "Unfortunately, that does happen sometimes. The justice system isn't perfect, and when people are under financial pressure, investigators tend to assume the worst about their motivations." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," I said, allowing my voice to crack slightly. "Patricia, I've been thinking about what you said at dinner that night, about how desperate people sometimes do desperate things. What if I can't prove my innocence? What if they decide that my financial problems and the art supplies are enough evidence to convict me?" "What are you thinking of doing?" she asked, and I caught the sharp interest in her voice, despite her attempt to maintain maternal concern. "Richard's passport is still valid from our honeymoon trip. I could use his credit cards to book a flight to somewhere without extradition treaties. It may be South America or Southeast Asia. If I leave now before they formally charge me, I might be able to disappear before they realize I'm gone." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see her calculating the implications of my proposed flight. If I ran, It would confirm my guilt in everyone's mind and eliminate the risk that I might eventually find evidence to expose her frame job. My disappearance would be the perfect conclusion to her campaign, providing definitive proof that she had been right about my character all along. "Emma, running away would make you look incredibly guilty," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. "It would destroy any chance you might have of proving your innocence later." "What innocence?" I replied bitterly. "Someone burned down my studio using accelerant that matches the paint thinner I bought. The fire started from inside the building when I was supposedly at home sleeping. Every piece of evidence points to me, and I can't prove otherwise." "Well, when you put it that way," Patricia said slowly, "I suppose I can understand why you might feel trapped. Sometimes people find themselves in situations where all the options are bad, and they have to choose the least terrible one." I could sense her internal struggle between maintaining her innocent facade and her desire to encourage my flight. The recording device was capturing every word, every subtle encouragement, every moment where she failed to provide the support that a truly concerned mother-in-law would offer. "You really think I should consider leaving?" I asked, making my voice small and defeated. "I think you need to be realistic about your options," Patricia replied, mark slipping slightly as her satisfaction began to show through. "If the evidence is as damaging as you say, and if you can't prove your innocence, then maybe protecting yourself has to be the priority. But what about Richard? What about our marriage? If I run, I'll lose everything." Patricia leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely relaxed. "Emma, dear, sometimes we have to accept that things aren't working out the way we hoped. Richard is a good man, but he deserves a wife who can provide stability and security. If you're facing criminal charges, you're not going to be able to give him the life he needs." The casual cruelty of her words was breathtaking, but I forced myself to remain in character. "You'd think he'd be better off without me." "I think Richard deserves a chance at happiness with someone who won't bring chaos and scandal into his life," she said, her tone becoming more confident as she sensed my apparent acceptance of defeat. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is step aside and let the people we care about find the peace they deserve." I nodded slowly, as if finally accepting the wisdom of her advice. "Maybe you're right. Maybe running away would actually be the best thing for everyone. Richard wouldn't have to deal with the embarrassment of a wife in prison, and I wouldn't have to face a trial I might not win." "It would certainly solve a lot of problems," Patricia agreed, unable to completely hide her satisfaction. "Knows, maybe eventually, when everything is settled down, you might be able to build a new life somewhere else." "There's just one thing I don't understand," I said, maintaining my defeated tone while preparing to spring my trap. "The fire investigation report mentions some technical details that don't make sense to me. Maybe you could help me understand how someone could have set this up so perfectly." Patricia's eyes sharpened instantly at my question. I watched her mental gears turning as she processed the shift in our conversation. For a moment, her carefully constructed facade wavered, revealing the calculating intelligence beneath. "Her motherly concern? What kind of technical details?" she asked cautiously, her voice losing some of its warmth. "Well, Jake Morrison from the fire department mentioned something about delayed ignition methods," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "He said whoever set the fire used some kind of timer system to make sure they weren't anywhere near the building when it started. Keep wondering how someone would know how to do something like that." Patricia relaxed slightly, apparently interpreting my question as evidence of my guilt rather than suspicion of hers. "I suppose anyone could research those things online these days. There's so much information available if you know where to look." "That's true," I agreed, nodding thoughtfully. "I've been doing some research myself, trying to understand how the investigators are building their case against me. Did you know they can tell exactly where the accelerant was poured based on the burn patterns? Jake said there were 3 separate pour points in my studio, arranged in a triangle pattern that would maximize the fire's spread." "How fascinating," Patricia said, but I caught a flicker of something in her expression, pride, perhaps, or satisfaction at having her work appreciated, even unknowingly. "The strangest part is how perfectly placed everything was," I continued, maintaining my tone of confused innocence. "The ignition point was positioned to destroy all my finished paintings first, then spread to the storage area where I kept my supplies. It's almost like whoever did it wanted to make sure there was nothing left that could be salvaged. Patricia shifted in her chair, and I noticed her hands had begun to fidget with her wedding ring, the same nervous habit I had observed whenever she was particularly pleased with herself during family gatherings. "Emma, why are you telling me all this?" she asked, but her tone suggested she was enjoying the technical discussion more than she was letting on. "Because I need to understand what I'm up against," I replied. "Like if I'm going to run, I need to know exactly what evidence they have and how strong their case is." Jake said the arsonist showed remarkable knowledge of fire behavior in building construction. They knew exactly how to make it look like an accident initially, while ensuring the damage would be total. Well, I suppose experience in real estate does teach you certain things about property vulnerabilities, Patricia said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The moment they left her mouth, I saw her realize what she had revealed. "Real estate experience?" I asked, tilting my head as if confused. "What does that have to do with fire investigation?" Patricia's face flushed slightly and she attempted to backtrack. "I just meant that after 30 years of dealing with property issues, insurance claims, and structural problems, you pick up knowledge about how buildings can fail. It's not uncommon for real estate professionals to understand these things." "That makes sense," I said, though internally I was celebrating. She had just connected herself to specialized knowledge about property destruction, and my phone was recording every word. "I never thought about how your background would give you insights into this kind of thing. It's unfortunate knowledge to have," Patricia said, regaining some of her composure. "Over the years, I've seen too many properties damaged by fires, floods, and other disasters. You learn to recognize the patterns, the warning signs, the ways that seemingly small problems can escalate into total losses, like knowing where to place accelerant for maximum effect?" I asked, maintaining my innocent tone while pushing for more specific admissions. Patricia paused, studying my face with new intensity. "Emma, these are very specific questions. Are you sure you're just trying to understand the case against you?" "I'm trying to understand everything," I said desperately. "Patricia, if I'm going to disappear and start over somewhere else, I need to know that I'm not leaving behind any loose ends that could be traced back to me. What if there's evidence I don't know about? What if someone saw something that could identify me as the arsonist?" The word arsonist hung in the air between us, and I watched Patricia process the implications of my apparent confession. Eyes lit up with a mixture of vindication and triumph that she couldn't quite suppress. "So you did set the fire," she said softly, leaning forward with intense satisfaction. "Does it matter anymore?" I replied, allowing exhaustion and defeat to color my voice. "The evidence is going to convict me, whether I admit it or not. At least this way, I can control what happens next, instead of waiting for them to arrest me." Patricia sat back in her chair, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely happy. The mask of concern had completely fallen, away replaced by open satisfaction at my apparent downfall. "I have to admit, Emma, I'm impressed," she said, her tone now carrying a note of respect I had never heard before. "When I first realized what you had done, I thought it was a desperate, poorly planned act. But the more I learned about how sophisticated the fire was, the more credit I had to give you. You realized what I had done?" I asked, careful to keep my voice neutral despite the adrenaline rushing through my system. "Oh yes," Patricia said, settling into what was clearly going to be a detailed explanation. The timing was obviously suspicious, the financial pressure, the insurance policy, the convenient late-night work sessions that established your presence at the studio. But it was the technical execution that really convinced me you were responsible. She was warming to her subject now, clearly relishing the opportunity to demonstrate her detective skills. The delayed ignition system was particularly clever. Using a cigarette as a timer with the paint thinner-soaked rags gave you almost 20 minutes to get home and establish your alibi. Most people wouldn't think of something like that. My heart was pounding as I realized she was describing details that hadn't been released to the public details that only the actual arsonist would know. "How do you know about the cigarette timer?" "Oh, my dear, I know much more than that," Patricia said with obvious pride. "I know about the 3 pour points arranged to maximize structural damage. I know about the electrical panel that was sabotaged to look like the initial cause. I know about the ventilation adjustments that ensured the fire would burn hot enough to destroy evidence, but controlled enough to avoid spreading to neighboring properties. Each detail she revealed was another nail in her own coffin, and I struggled to maintain my defeated expression while internally celebrating the thoroughness of her confession. She was so intoxicated by her own cleverness that she had forgotten to maintain even the pretense of ignorance. "Patricia," I said slowly, "how could you possibly know all those details?" The question seemed to penetrate her euphoria, and I watched her face change as she realized what she had been saying. But instead of panic, I saw calculation in her eyes, as if she were weighing her options and deciding how much more to reveal. "Because I made sure every detail was perfect," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of defiant pride. "Because after 3 years of watching you drag my son down with your selfish dreams and financial irresponsibility, I decided it was time to solve the problem permanently." The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I had been preparing for it. Hearing her casually acknowledge framing me for arson, ruining my life, and potentially sending me to prison was more chilling than I had anticipated. "You set the fire," I said, no longer needing to fake my shock. "I solved a problem that was never going to resolve itself," Patricia replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "Richard deserves a wife who can provide stability and support his career, not someone who burns through their savings on art supplies and unrealistic dreams. The insurance money will help him get back on his feet, and your disappearance will free him to find someone more suitable." "But you're letting me take the blame for your crime," I said, genuine anger beginning to creep into my voice. Patricia shrugged with breathtaking callousness. "You were never going to make Richard happy anyway, Emma. This way, everyone gets what they need. Richard gets financial relief and freedom from a destructive marriage. I get the daughter-in-law situation resolved, and you get the fresh start you're apparently planning anyway. By framing me for arson and forcing me to flee the country, by giving you the motivation to finally do what you should have done years ago," Patricia said coldly. "Sometimes people need dramatic circumstances to make necessary changes." Simply provided the catalyst. The recording device had captured everything: her detailed knowledge of the arson methods, her admission of guilt, her callous justification for destroying my life. But I wasn't finished yet. I needed her to acknowledge the full scope of her manipulation, the years of psychological warfare that had led to this moment. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. Patricia smiled with genuine warmth for the first time in our conversation. "Since the day Richard introduced you to me, dear. I've been waiting for the right opportunity ever since." For my phone on the coffee table and slowly turned off the music streaming interface, revealing the recording app that had been capturing our entire conversation. The red recording indicator pulsed steadily, showing 43 minutes of audio that would change everything. Tricia's face went completely white as she understood what had just happened. "You recorded me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Every single word," I confirmed, my defeated persona finally dropping away to reveal the calm determination that had been building for weeks. "Your detailed knowledge of the delayed ignition system, the cigarette timer, the 3-pour points, the electrical panel sabotage. Details that were never released to the public, Patricia. Details that only the real arsonist would know." She lunged for my phone, but I was ready for her reaction and pulled it back safely. "It's already uploaded to cloud storage," I said, matter-of-factly. "Deleting it from this device won't accomplish anything." Patricia collapsed back into her chair, her perfectly controlled composure finally cracking completely. "You manipulative little witch. You tricked me into saying those things." "I gave you the opportunity to tell the truth," I replied calmly. "You chose to confess to arson, conspiracy, and framing an innocent person for felony charges." "Were your words, Patricia, not mine." The sound of car doors slamming outside interrupted her response. Through the window, I could see Detective Rodriguez and 2 uniformed officers walking up Patricia's front path. I had texted Jake during our conversation, using a prearranged signal that meant I had obtained the confession we needed. "You called." "The police?" Patricia said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "I called my friend Jake, who called Detective Rodriguez," I corrected. "They've been waiting outside for my signal. I wanted to make sure you had every opportunity to tell the complete truth before they came in." The doorbell rang, and I could hear Detective Rodriguez identifying herself and requesting entry. Patricia remained frozen in her chair, staring at me with a mixture of hatred and something that might have been grudging respect. "Mrs. Chen, would you please answer the door?" Detective Rodriguez called out. I walked to the front entrance and opened it, greeting Detective Rodriguez with the first genuine smile I had worn in weeks. "Detective, thank you for coming so quickly. I believe I have something that will interest you regarding the arson investigation." Patricia had managed to compose herself somewhat by the time the officers entered her living room, but her face was still pale, and her hands were trembling slightly. Detective Rodriguez looked between us with professional curiosity, clearly sensing the tension in the room. "Mrs. Chen contacted us with some new information about the studio fire," Detective Rodriguez said, addressing Patricia directly. "She claims to have evidence that might change our understanding of the case." I have a recording of Patricia confessing to setting the fire herself and framing me for the crime, I said simply, holding up my phone. She provided details about the arson methods that were never made public, and she admitted to planning this for years. Detective Rodriguez's expression sharpened immediately. "Mrs. Chen, I need to advise you of your rights before we continue this conversation." As the detective read Patricia her Miranda rights, I watched the last of her imperious confidence drain away. The woman who had spent years manipulating family dynamics and community relationships to destroy my life was now facing the consequences of her own overconfidence. "I want to hear this recording," Detective Rodriguez said once the formalities were complete. We listened to the audio together, Patricia's voice clear and damning as she described the technical details of the arson and her motivations for framing me. When her recorded voice said, "I made sure every detail was perfect," Patricia closed her eyes and seemed to shrink into herself. "Mrs. Chen, you're under arrest for arson in the first degree, insurance fraud, and conspiracy," Detective Rodriguez announced, nodding to the uniformed officers, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "This won't hold up in court," Patricia said desperately, as the cuffs clicked into place. "She entrapped me. She deliberately deceived me into making those statements." Mrs. Chen had every right to record a conversation in her own defense. Detective Rodriguez replied, "An entrapment only applies to law enforcement officers, not private citizens gathering evidence of crimes committed against them." As they led Patricia toward the door, she turned back to look at me one final time. "Richard will never forgive you for this," she said, her voice venomous. "You've destroyed his family."
Richard will understand that I protected myself from
"Someone who is trying to destroy my life," I replied calmly. "And he'll learn to live with the truth about his mother, just like I learned to live with years of her manipulation." The house felt strangely peaceful after they left. I sat in Patricia's perfect living room, surrounded by her awards and photographs and carefully arranged displays of success, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope for the future. My phone rang, and Richard's name appeared. On the screen, I answered it knowing that this conversation would determine whether our marriage could survive the revelation of his mother's crimes. "Emma, Detective Rodriguez just called me," he said, his voice strained but not angry. "She told me about the recording, about what Mom confessed to." "Is it true?" "Every word of it," I replied gently. "Richard, I'm so sorry you had to learn about this. I know how much you love her." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I keep thinking about all the times she warned me about you, all the concerns she raised about our marriage. Was she planning this the whole time? Think she was looking for an opportunity from the beginning?" I said honestly. "The art supplies and our financial problems just gave her the perfect chance to act." "I can't believe I almost lost you because of her lies," Richard said, and I could hear the pain in his voice. "Emma, can you ever forgive me for not seeing what she was doing?" "There's nothing to forgive," I told him. "She fooled everyone, Richard. That's what made her so dangerous." 6 months later, Patricia was sentenced to 8 years in prison. For arson and conspiracy charges, the insurance company not only dropped their fraud investigation against me, but expedited the payout for my destroyed studio. Richard and I used part of the money to relocate to Portland, where I opened a new studio and began rebuilding my artistic career. The gallery exhibition that had started this whole nightmare finally took place, featuring new work I created after the fire. The paintings were darker than my previous pieces, exploring themes of deception, resilience, and the hidden motivations that drive people to destroy what others have built. The opening night was a success, with several pieces selling to collectors who were drawn to the emotional intensity of the work. Richard found a position with a Portland accounting firm and began therapy to process the complicated grief of losing his mother to prison rather than death. Our marriage, tested by fire in the most literal sense, emerged stronger than it had ever been. Patricia never apologized or acknowledged the pain she had caused. In her mind, she remained the victim of circumstances and my manipulation, unable to accept responsibility for the choices that had led to her downfall. But her inability to find redemption was no longer my concern. Standing in my new studio, surrounded by canvases filled with color and possibility, I realized that Patricia had given me an unexpected gift. Her attempt to destroy my life had forced me to discover reserves of strength and determination I never knew I possessed. The woman who emerged from that ordeal was someone who would never again allow herself to be diminished by others' expectations or manipulations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Click and check them out.